If I were to introduce Samuel J. Kaiser in any detail, it would take up all of our lecture time. He's Professor Emeritus of Linguistics at MIT. His work in linguistics in many areas of linguistics is extremely well known. You can Google it. You can see his Wikipedia page. You can see his page at MIT. I won't go over all of that, but I will note that he has also been very active in writing in various other areas, written novels, travel, books. I don't know what else to call them, and this book, which is not directly structural linguistics, although it is related to linguistic analysis, as you'll see. So he's been very active in many areas. He's also at MIT was the head of the Department of Linguistics and Philosophy for about 20 years. He was the director of the Center for Cognitive Science. He's been the associate provost of MIT, special assistant to the chancellor. And so he's been very involved in the institution and in the field. He's the general editor of Linguistic Inquiry, has been for many years. So we're delighted to have him with us today to tell us about the first part today of the mental life of modernism. So please turn on your microphones briefly now so we can do the actual clapping, which represents welcome to our speaker.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you all. I'm going to have to say goodbye to this wonderful collage that I'm looking at now, because I'm going to share my PowerPoint presentation with you, but it's absolutely incredible that I can look at all of you from all over the world. It makes me very happy. So here I go now. I'm going to share the screen, and Vincent, you're standing by, right?
Yes.
Okay, so here we go. Let's see, I want my PowerPoint presentation. Oh, I want to share the sound, the PowerPoint presentation. And now what I want to do is...
So if in sharing, if you go under advanced settings and you see portion of the screen?
Yeah, so I think what I did there, I have to, let me do that again.
And then you should be able to...
Yeah, now I go to advanced. There we go. And I click portion of the screen, and then I say share. And then I go to slideshow. I want to do slide. And I do, okay, so now let's see if I can. Yes, and that, so are you now just seeing the screen? Okay, and you can all hear me? Perfect. Okay, so I would like to, Vincent, on the right, I see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 little mini pictures of Lottie and John and some other parts. Is there some way of making that go away?
That, I'm not sure. I think you might be able to minimize if in the top there should be some small rectangles. It's either, you can minimize it if it's one small rectangle.
Good for you. Boy, you really know your way around. Wow, wow. All right. So let me begin by thanking John Balin for giving me the opportunity to talk to you today. To Lottie Balin, his mother, for doing such a wonderful job in raising him. To Vincent Czarnecki, who has been a magnificent technical support and has shown me things that I couldn't I didn't know about at all, and is making this presentation so much easier for me. And also, I would like to thank Anna Neva Kazan for those wonderful posters. It's really been a delight to just work with all of these people. All right, so what I'm going to do today is mental life of modernism, today and on Thursday. As John mentioned, this was really basically a run-through of a book I wrote that was published by MIT Press in March of last year. I just wanted to say that this book came to be written after a lifetime of thinking about the remarkable shift that occurred at the turn of the 20th century, the one that essentially entered, ushered a period called modernism. And as you can see from this is the wonderful cover of the book. It was designed by Yasuyo Iguchi, who's a designer at MIT Press. I've known her for over 50 years. So what I'm really going to talk to you about is why poetry, painting, and music changed at the turn of the 20th century. Now, the period which is called modernism is the name given to a sea change that came over the sister arts of poetry, music, and painting around the turn of the 20th century. There are indications of it, maybe 50 years before. Baudelaire indicates his unhappiness with the way things were in an introduction to a book that he, in a letter to a friend of his in 1863. So what happened? What happened? Well, poetry ceased to be metrical and to rhyme. Music ceased to be tonal. And painting ceased to be representational. Now, this is a remarkable confluence of artistic events, and surely they cry out for an explanation. They really seem to be related. And I would like to try to answer that question in these lectures. So I would like to answer the question, what happened to cause this sea change? And I'd like to begin with a hypothesis. Namely, art is the product of shared rules. Well, what I mean by this is that an artist uses rules to construct a work of art, and an audience uses those same rules to parse, i.e. to understand that work of art. So there is this symbiotic relationship. It's just like the one that you and I are engaging in now. We're able to communicate precisely because we share rules. You share the same rules of English that I have, and that is why we're able to exchange meaning. If you were to switch into one of your native languages, which I don't know, then I don't share the rules, communication ends. So interestingly enough, this hypothesis that I'm going to present is rather like a suggestion made by two neurobiologists, Bentley and Hoy, in 1974, in a Scientific American article that they wrote on the neurobiology of cricket song with respect to the genetic mechanism governing chirping calls between male and female crickets. And here's what they said, and I'm quoting, their work, quote, suggests that similar genetic systems could be involved in encoding information for constructing either a neuronal network that will respond to a specific song pattern or a network that will produce a specific song pattern. Indeed, there is the fascinating possibility that some of the same genes are involved in both systems. Such an assemblage of genes would be a fail-safe means of ensuring the synchronous evolution of the transmitter and the receiver. In other words, if the same genes are in the male cricket are used to transmit a song, if those same genes are used by the female cricket to receive that song, that would be a wonderful way for nature to make sure that if the crickets evolve, the communication between them in order to propagate cricketry would not be interrupted. And interestingly enough, that's exactly what I'm saying about art. That I suspect that it's exactly the same set of rules that are used in both. So let me just say a very quick, I want to give you a very quick account of what shared rules are. This may be something that many of you know, but it may not, but others of you may not. So I'll forgive me if I'm being too elementary here. But consider a sentence like this. Instinctively, eagles that fly swim. Well, this sentence is interesting. In English, it means that fly swim. And this is odd because we know by common ornithological knowledge, ornithological knowledge tells us that what eagles do instinctively is fly, not swim. So there is something about the construction of the sentence that forces instinctively to modify swim, not fly, even though it, pun intended, flies in the face of common sense. So what is it? Well, a natural first hypothesis might involve distance between the adverb instinctively and the verb either fly or swim. But how do you measure distance? Clearly, if you measure distance in terms of words, the distance, how many words there are between, say, the adverb and the verb, you would expect that instinctively would modify the closest. So you start with instinctively, which is word 1, you count eagles 2 and that 3, and there's fly 4. But that doesn't work. Instinctively actually goes, as I said, with swim. But suppose you measure the distance in terms of this kind of structure. That is to say, if you put this structure over the sentence, instinctively eagles that fly swim, you're saying that instinctively is an adverb, that eagles that fly is a noun phrase, that fly is a clause modifying the noun eagles, and that verb is the main verb. And now if you count in terms of the nodes that separate the adverb instinctively from the two verbs in the sentence, you can see that indeed the adverb instinctively is closest to the main verb and not to the subordinated verb in the clause. So it looks like this. And the heavily dotted lines indicate the path to fly, and the tiny dotted lines indicate the path to swim. And if you count, you can see from adverb 1, 2, 3, swim, but from adverb to fly is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, fly. All right. So this kind of, so the explanation then is that an adverb goes with its nearest verb, where nearest is defined in terms of the labels of nodes on a tree that one associate with a string, like instinctively eagles that fly swim. This kind of dependency, which is extremely well known, is true of every language in the world. It's called structure dependency. And I raise it here because structural dependency provided two researchers, Neil Smith and Iantha Marie Simpley, with an interesting idea having to do with how the brain works when it acquires language. I want to explore this a bit because I think it sheds a great deal of light on what gave rise to modernism. In short, I want to lay the groundwork for arguing that the shift called modernism was a lot like replacing one's natural language with an artificial one. That's really the heart of what I'm saying. I want to argue that this shift actually involved a shift in what areas of the brain were involved in experiencing works of art before and after the advent of modernism. And I might say that there's a lot of experimental evidence which points to the truth of that statement in abstract art. For example, in my book, I refer to some work by an Israeli experimentalist who shows that different parts of the brain are involved when you look at representational art and when you look at abstract art. Anyway, this is what Smith and Simpley.
Sorry to interrupt. I'm just not sure. I got one message in the chat saying that the screen is black, and I also see that. Is this slide just black, or?
No,
Yeah.
I turned the screen black because I'm now talking, and I didn't want people to.
Thank you.
Oh, it's my fault. I apologize. It's okay. Everything is normal.
Just wanted to make sure. Sorry for interrupting.
Not at all. I won't do that anymore. I didn't realize it would be an obstruction here. There. I thought it would be more interesting to look at black than blue, but if you think it's better this way, okay. Anyway, In 1995, Smith and Simply published called The Mind of a Savant. And this is the story of Christopher, a young man who had a remarkable ability to acquire a language, but whose general intelligence was severely impaired. For example, he couldn't count. He spoke with some degree of competence Danish, Dutch, Finnish, French, German, Hindi, Italian, modern Greek, Norwegian, Polish, Portuguese, Russian, Spanish, Swedish, Turkish, and Welsh. And yet he couldn't count to 3. And so what Smith and Simply did was they taught Christopher and a group of normal undergraduates an artificial language, which they called Epun. And what this artificial language, what was important about this artificial language was that it used rules that one typically found in languages throughout the world, like subject-verb agreement or movement, things of that sort, displacement. And then after they had acquired some facility in this artificial language, Smith and Simply threw in a monkey wrench. They introduced a set of sentences in which the rule required that you be able to count. And this is what they did. The rule said, insert nog, this morpheme nog, after the 3rd word from the beginning of every sentence. 1, 2, 3, nog. 1, 2, 3, nog. 1, 2, 3, nog. I think that nog was meant to be an emphatic marker. But what's interesting is no language in the world has a rule like this. In other words, no language in the world would even hypothesizes the notion of counting. So you insert something, 3 words from the beginning or 4 words from the end or whatever. But no language in the world does that. And interestingly, when they introduced this language, this particular construction in this artificial language, Christopher couldn't get it. Well, of course he couldn't. He couldn't count. But interestingly, neither could the undergraduates. They didn't get it either. Now, that's these 2 facts are what are very important, because what they suggest is that when you are in a language learning mode in the brain, essentially the brain helps you out by offering a number of possible hypotheses and by withholding hypotheses which are impossible. And what it suggests is that the brain does not ever put forward the notion of a hypothesis that involves counting, because that's not what it means to know to have knowledge of a language. Well, some 21 years later, Andrea Moro wrote performed a series of experiments in which he described in a book called The Boundaries of Babel. And he worked, this was in 2016, he worked with Italian, German, and Japanese speakers and taught each of them versions of a language that they didn't know, just the way Smith and Simply did it. He reports on one experiment in which 8 German-speaking subjects, 4 men and 4 women, all right-handed, all having been exposed only to their native language, were taught a version of Italian with both possible and impossible rules. Impossible rules being rules like counting. With the benefit of fMRI mapping, which Smith and Simply didn't have, he was able to observe brain activity while participants worked on their tasks of learning these this simplified Italian. And when they were asked to judge the grammaticality of sentences constructed with possible rules, Broca's area showed heightened activity. But when they were asked to judge the grammaticality of sentences constructed with impossible rules, activity in Broca's area diminished. So this is essentially what Andrea Moro, how he summarized his finding. The brain has, quote, sorted out the syntactic data without the subjects realizing it. Broca's area, which is included in the network that is naturally predisposed for syntactic tasks, has been progressively activated when processing rules that respected structure dependency, while it has been progressively deactivated when processing sentences that did not. All right, so let's ask again, what happened? What I'm going to propose is well, first of all, I'd like to tell you what people normally say about what happened. They normally have given cultural explanations of modernism. So Eric Kandel, a Nobel Prize-winning neurologist, argues modernism began. He wrote a book about abstract expressionism in the Viennese school of abstract expressionism, painters like Klimt and Kokoschka. Okay, so he said, modernism began in the mid-19th century as a response not only to the restrictions and hypocrisies of everyday life, but also as a reaction to the Enlightenment's emphasis on the rationality of human behavior. Paul Delaroche, a French painter, on seeing his first daguerreotype, is reported to have said, daguerreotype is an early form of photography, is reported to have said, painting is dead. And Richard Taruskin, in his monumental Oxford History of Western Music, talked about the changes that occurred at the turn of the 20th century, changes that shifted music from Mahler to Schoenberg, were the result of apocalyptic presentiments. And what he meant by that was the same kind of dread that so many people around the world felt when the year 2000 came around, the so-called Y2K phenomena, which turned out to be a dud. Nothing actually happened. The trouble with these, with respect to poetry, I should mention that Ezra Pound took the lead in abandoning meter, metrical poetry, which characterized most poetry in English prior to the 20th century. And in his 81st canto, he wrote, you can see it's in red there, to break the pentameter, that was the first heave. And in a letter to a poet asking his advice, a woman named Mary Barnard, he said, he expressed his unhappiness with metricality, saying, against the metric pattern, struggle toward natural speech. You haven't yet got sense of quantity. The best mechanism for breaking up the stiffness in literary idiom is a different meter. The goddamn iambic magnetizes certain verbal sequences. And the reason why I mention Pound is because Pound was an incredible influence on the poetry which followed. Donald Hall said that he was basically responsible for the shape of modern poetry in his book, Remembering Poets. Ernest Hemingway, I'll give you a quote later on from Ernest Hemingway showing you how important were the pronouncements of Ezra Pound. So this is not just an idle quotation. This was from somebody who was a tremendous influence on poetry, and he said, stop writing meter. All right, now the problem with, normally at this point, I would have done this, but I'm not going to do that. The problem with all of these explanations is that they are sui generis. That is to say, each one is unique to its own art form and does not generalize. Kandel's suggestion that modernism resulted from a reaction to the Enlightenment's emphasis on rationality doesn't explain why poetry ceased to be metrical or to rhyme, or why music ceased to be tonal. Moreover, eschewing rhyme and meter in poetry a la Pound, because they are somehow stultifying, says nothing about what happened in painting and music. And apocalyptic presentiments knocking tonal music out of the box says nothing about poetry or painting. Now, it may be that the three are unrelated, but there are two reasons to believe otherwise. First, the same thing happened to all three art forms. Constraints closely associated with each one were abandoned. Now, the reason why that's interesting is the next point. Before the abandonment, poetry, music, and painting were easily accessible. After the abandonment, poetry, music, and painting were inaccessible. That is, each became an acquired taste that had to be learned. And that's what's interesting, that the art before the modernism's shift was so easy to understand that you didn't have to take a college course in it in order to see what was going on, because somehow or other it was very accessible. But afterwards, all three of them became inaccessible, and you really had to push yourself to see what was going on. I'm not saying that that wasn't without its own kind of rewards. I'm just saying that it's a different psychological behavior. Now, so here is an alternative account of modernism, and this is the one that I'm going to push. It's the nature of the constraints that matters. From this perspective, what happened at the turn of the 20th century was not fundamentally a cultural phenomenon. Rather, it was a rule-based phenomenon. And I'm not talking about rules like never end a sentence with a preposition. I mean descriptions intended of our mental capacity to acquire and to use language, for example, or to parse a musical composition, or to recognize a two-dimensional representation of a three-dimensional world. So here's my hypothesis. The sister arts of poetry, painting, and music depend upon shared sets of rules, just as language depends upon a shared set of rules. Artists exercise such rules when they create a work of art, say a poem. Audiences exercise the same shared set of rules when they encounter that work of art. It's the exercise of these rules occasioned by the artwork that is the source of artistic pleasure. You might call this the cricket theory of art. At the turn of the 20th century, artists abandoned shared rules based on the natural predilections of the brain. That's why they were accessible, because of a perception that the output of the rules had been exhausted. And when that happened, they were, of course, the resultant art forms were inaccessible. So why rules to begin with? Here I'd like to quote from a set of lectures that Igor Stravinsky gave at Harvard in 1939 and 40. This was, he was en route from Nazi Germany to America because he wanted to escape what was happening on the continent. And he was invited to give these lectures. And I think he went right from here to Los Angeles, where he spent the rest of his life. Anyway, here's what Stravinsky said. He said, and yet which of us has ever heard talk of art as other than a realm of freedom? This sort of heresy, now the heresy is that art is freedom. This sort of heresy is uniformly widespread because it is imagined that art is outside the bounds of ordinary activity. And that's what I'm saying. I'm saying art is not outside the bounds of ordinary activity. Pre-modernism art is not. Well, he says, as in art, as in everything else, one can build only upon a resisting foundation. Whatever constantly gives way to pressure constantly renders movement impossible. So you need to have rules. You have to have constraints in order to have art. So here's the picture thus far. Art needs rules. Abandoning shared rules meant creating unshared rules. Unshared rules were by definition private. Private rules were by definition not naturally accessible. Art appreciation became an Easter egg hunt. Okay, now I want to show you what I mean by Easter egg hunt. And I'm going to do this by showing you first a logo. This is the famous FedEx logo. I'm sure all of you have seen it, but there's an Easter egg hidden in this logo. And I'm going to wait a few seconds to see if you can see what there is in this design beside the name FedEx. All right, here's the Easter egg if you haven't seen it. This is the FedEx logo, and here's an arrow. And this is put into the logo by the juxtaposition of a capital E and a small x. The designer of this logo was a man by the name of Lyndon Leader. And I happened to find this marvelous quote by him on an e-zine on the internet called The Sneeze in November 16, 2004. Here's what he said, and this is as good an explanation of a Easter egg as you can find, I think. He said, the power of the hidden arrow is simply that it is a, quote, hidden bonus. It is a positive reverse optical kind of thing. Either you see it or you don't. Importantly, not getting the punchline by not seeing the arrow does not reduce the impact of the logo's essential communication. On the other hand, if you do see the arrow or someone points it out to you, you won't forget it. Okay, so he put this arrow in as a kind of a hidden bonus, but as he says, it doesn't matter whether you saw it or not. Here's another case. Do you know about the Easter egg hidden in this iconic poster of this horror film, The Silence of the Lambs? Can you find the Easter egg in this poster? I wish there was some way for me to know how many of you see it and how many of you don't. But there isn't the way we're doing it now. I should mention, by the way, about this Easter egg, I'm going back because I want to read you a quote. The Silence of the Lambs poster is an instantly recognizable classic that transports you directly to the all too familiar iconic scenes that are now embedded in the horror genre's Hall of Fame. This was written to me by someone named Mia Moore when I wrote to her on the internet, does anybody know who designed this poster? Because I couldn't find for months, I couldn't find anybody who designed it. And that's not a surprise because the poster was not authorized by the estate of one of the persons who created the Easter egg. And now I'm going to show you the Easter egg in this poster. The moth that you see in place of the mouth is an African death's head hawk moth. It appears to be a skull right here. And in fact, the real moth does have a vaguely skull-like pattern there. But it's actually, this pattern here is actually a very compressed reduction of this. And that is a photograph that was designed by Salvador Dali and Philip Halsman called In Voluptate Mors. It was created in 1951. And it was intended, the photograph was intended to talk about the temptation of Saint Anthony and his struggle with this transcending the desire for flesh during his awakening in the desert. And what Sam Green did was he took that juxtaposition of nude figures that formed themselves into the shape of a skull, and he reduced it and put it on the head there. If you didn't know that, the impact of the poster is the same, but if you do know that, it's just that much more interesting. It's a bonus. By the way, in order to put this photograph into my book, I had to, of course, get permission from the Philippe Halsman estate. He was the photographer. And his grandson, who is the executor of the estate, told me that the usage of this photograph was completely unauthorized. They did not want the nature of, they did not want this image associated with a film about a psychopathic woman-hating serial murderer. And they were very unhappy with that because this was in fact an image about Saint Anthony in the desert. Now, this business of Easter eggs is not new. It's by no means 20th century. If you go back in time, you can find examples of Easter eggs, and I'm going to show you two. I'm going to start in the 14th century, but I think if you go all the way back to the Bible, you can find them in the verses in the Song of Songs. But let's take a look at this one, because this is, in a way, the most elaborate Easter egg, musical Easter egg ever created. And it's quite remarkable. But here, Guillaume de Machaut was a 14th century French poet and composer. He composed this poem, "My end is my beginning, and my beginning my end." And the tenor is sung in the normal way, "My end is my beginning." My third voice, 3 times only, turns back on itself and thus ends, "My end is my beginning, and my beginning my end." So here's the French version of that. And what he's doing here, he has this chiasmatic sentence, "My end is my beginning, my end." And in between, these are kind of instructions on how to sing it. I'd like you to listen to it. And I want you to see if you can hear the Easter egg. And I guarantee you that unless there's a Mozart out there in the listening to this now, you won't. Here it is. All right, that is enough to give you the Easter egg, if in fact you could hear it. But as I said, I doubt seriously that anyone can. God knows I can't. It's quite a remarkable piece of work. Look, this is the music. Consists of 3 parts, a triplum, a cantus, and a tenor. This is 20 bars, and this is 20 bars. If you notice the tenor part first, the last note, in the 20th bar, is the first note in the 21st bar. The penultimate note in the 20th bar is the second note in the 21st bar. The antepenultimate note in the 20th bar is the same note in the 21st bar. In other words, the tenor part, which ends here, then goes on, and it just is it's the first 20 bars backwards. So if you wanted to read this music, you wanted to read the tenor part, you wouldn't need the music on the left. All you would need is the music on the right. And just remember that when you got here, just read it backwards. That's just for the tenor part. The triplum does the same thing. The triplum actually reverses. But interestingly enough, when the triplum reverses at the 20th bar, it does not reverse itself, but you'll find the triplum is reversed by the cantus. And the cantus does not reverse itself the way the tenor did. It is taken up by the triplum. So the triplum and the cantus change relationships at the 20th measure, but the tenor doesn't. And so this is what it looks like. Triplum, here's the 20 bar boundary. The tenor goes 20 bars, and then what's meant by this is then it reverses itself. The triplum goes 20 bars, but then it's reversed just the way the tenor did, but not by the triplum voice, but by the cantus voice. And the cantus goes 20 bars, and then it's reversed, but not by the cantus, but by the triplum. It's virtually, and you can see why he did that, because he says, my end is my beginning, and my beginning is my end. He wanted to create this chiasmic structure in the music. So this perfectly parallels this. This kind of musical construction is called a retrograde, and it's probably the finest example of a retrograde that you'll find in Western music. And there's no way of if you are an innocent audience just listening to it. And that's what Leander meant, Lyndon Leander meant when he said that it's a hidden bonus. Now, it's not limited to music and poetry, but here is a translation by Geoffrey Chaucer of a ballad by Othon de Granson, who was a French Savoyard knight who fell out of favor with the King of France and was forced to go to London, where he met Chaucer. They became friends, and Chaucer translated this ballad into Middle English. Now, what the ballad is about here, it says, certainly love, it makes a lot of sense that what you sell comes at a high value. And here's the cost of it. Here's how expensive it is. When you want when you want to, you're awake when you're in bed, and you fast when you're at the dining table. You laugh when you should be crying, and you cry when you're singing. You lower the edge when you ought to be looking. You often change your color and countenance. You complain when you're sleeping. You dream at the dance. All the reverse of what one ought to find. Now, Chaucer has stayed rather close to that, but he has not done it literally. He's actually changed a few things. And his version of this focuses on the fact that when you're in love, you experience all the reverse of any glad feeling. And this notion reverse is what's important, and I'll show you why. What Chaucer has done here, he's constructed his translation so that the first line consists of a gerund and an infinitive, weeping to laugh, followed by an infinitive and a gerund, A, B, B, A. So the second half of the line is a reversal of the first. And the seventh line, he's done the same thing, except he's reversed it. Now, instead of A, B, B, A, he's done B, A, A, B. And between the two lines, he's made 5 and 6 completely parallel, so that 4 and 5 is mirrored by 6 and 7. In other words, Chaucer has done that. There's no way, I suspect that you're not going to see that when you hear that poem read. I mean, if you can imagine, now, certes love it is convenable that men vulgaire be the noble thing, as walk a bed and fasten at the table, wiping to laugh and singing complaining. You're not computing the reversal, but that doesn't matter. It doesn't affect the meaning, just the way Lyndon Leander said. All right, so I've now shown you two things. I've shown you what shared rules means in syntax, in language, and I've shown you what an Easter egg is all about. And now, in order for me to drive my hypothesis home, I have to show you that shared rules exist for the other two art forms that for meter. For the sister art forms, poetry, music, and painting. So let's start with shared rules for poetic meter. I'd like you to take a look at this poem by John Keats. It's a sonnet, and it's called How Many Bards Gild the Lapses of Time. And because of time, I'm not going to read the whole poem to you, but I'll just read the first 7 lines. How many bards gild the lapses of time? A few of them have ever been the food of my delighted fancy. I could brood over their beauties, earthly or sublime, and often when I sit me down to rhyme, these will in throngs before my mind intrude, but no confusion, no disturbance rude do they occasion, 'tis a pleasing chime. That's the octet, the first part of the poem, the octave. All right, you can see it's metrical, it's iambic pentameter, and you can see that it rhymes. A, B, B, A, time sublime, food brood, rhyme, then rhyme, intrude, rude, chime. Okay. What are the rules that determine the metricality of this poem? Here's a very simple and quick lesson in poetic scansion. I might say that this is work that was begun a long time ago by Morris Halley and me in about 1960s. We wrote a paper called Chaucer and the Study of Prosody. And what's happened is that it's sort of produced a cottage industry, and there's been a lot of advances made in understanding metricality since then, and it's gone a very long way. I'm going to use this particular set of rules because it's very easy to explain it to an audience. You don't have to be technically adept to get it. But I hasten to add that there are many people who think that this is really not quite the way this isn't the way to do it. My point is, it doesn't matter who's right in the metrical discussion. What really matters is that there are shared rules, and every metricist agrees on that point. So I'm going to say, look, suppose these are the shared rules. There's a notion of stress max, and a stress maximum is a stress syllable surrounded on both sides by a lesser stress syllable. That's just a definition. It says that there's a relationship in languages which have stress, which we can extract, and that relationship is tatata. That is to say, there's unstressed syllables surrounded by a stressed one. I'm going to say that there's a metrical pattern which consists of elements W and S standing for weak and strong, that W and S together you might think of as a foot. I won't have need to make use of the term foot here, so I'm just going to focus on the elements. And the iambic refers to the fact that it's weak before strong. If it were strong before weak, it would be called trochaic, and weak, weak, strong, anapestic, strong, weak, dactylic. I'm focusing on weak, strong. That's iambic, and because this WS pair is repeated 5 times, it's a pentameter, where pentameter, pent is the root 5. Okay, now here's the constraint. So it's very simple. There's a metrical pattern, there's a stress maximum definition, and there's a constraint. And the constraint says that a stress maximum must always correspond to an S position. Now I have to explain to you what I mean by correspond. So let's take this line, the 7th line of the sonnet. It contains the word confusion and disturbance. Few is a stress maximum because it's surrounded to the left by a lesser stress syllable and to the right by a lesser stress syllable. Turb is a stress maximum because it is surrounded to the left by an unstressed syllable, to the right by an unstressed syllable. Correspond means that when you write out this line, you can actually draw a vertical line between the syllable, each syllable of the line, and each element of the meter. But W, no S, con W, fuse S, shun W, no S, so on and so forth. So that's what it means. Now, so few is a stress maximum, disturb is a stress maximum. The vertical lines have made a correspondence between the syllables and the metrical structure. And now the constraint says that if a line contains a stress maximum, it must always correspond to an S position. This line contains 2 stress maxima, this one, and this one. And when you follow the vertical line, you see that, that the vertical line connects to an S. The constraint is met, the line is metrical. Now let's take a look at the first line. How many bards gild the lapses of time? I want to focus your attention on the word lapses. Lap is a stress maximum. It's surrounded to the left by the and to the right by the plural suffix, the lapses. That's the only stress maximum in this line. Here's the correspondence. And now notice that syllable corresponds to a W position. So if this is your theory of meter, 1, 2, 3, the constraint says a stress maximum must always correspond to an S position is violated, and the lap is the syllable that violates it. So the first line is unmetrical. Now this is a problem. You can either say that the poet made a mistake to make when you're thinking, when you're dealing with a poet of the consummate artistry of John Keats. Poets like that don't make mistakes. So, okay, what's more likely is that the theoretician has made a mistake and the theory is not right, so that my theory up here, 1, 2, 3, is wrong. But there is a third possibility, isn't there? And the third possibility is that both are right, that the theory is right, that the line is unmetrical, and Keats wanted it to be unmetrical. Why would he want it to be unmetrical? Because lapse is an Easter egg. The line, the lapses of time, refers to badly metrically written lines. In other words, how many bards gild the lapses of time is an example of what it's about, an unmetrical line. It's a joke. And there's no way that Keats could expect you to get that joke unless he also expected you to share the same rules that he had when he constructed the joke. And that's what I mean by rules being shared. It's no different than if I were to tell you a joke in English. If I were to say a duck walks into a pharmacist and says to the pharmacist, "I'd like chapstick, please." And the pharmacist says to the duck, "Oh yeah? And how do you propose to pay for it?" And the duck says, "Well, just put it on my bill." The only way I could expect you to get that joke is if I expected you to have a lexical entry bill, which is identical to my lexical entry bill, and that one meaning was invoice and the other meaning was proboscis. And I set up a joke in such a way that you expect to hear invoice and the surprise is proboscis. Okay, so that's how rules can be shared other than grammatical rules. That's how metrical rules can be shared. And in fact, as I'm suggesting, this poem by Keats shows that they must be shared. What about the tonal music? Well, shared rules exist here as well. I'm going to show you examples of grouping rules, tonal structure, and metrical structure. I will simply say at the outset that there is a myriad of psychological studies which suggest that grouping is in fact psychologically real. So is tonal structure, and so is metrical structure. The rules that I am suggesting are, I'm adopting lock, stock, and barrel from Lerdahl's and Jackendorf's seminal work in 1983 called A Generative Theory of Tonal Music. What they claimed was that in order to understand, these are the rules you need in order to understand music, in the same way that there are grammatical rules that you have to have in order to understand a language. One set of rules are grouping rules, and they say that the basic unit of grouping is a group of one or more adjacent notes in the musical structure, and adjacent notes can be combined into larger groups. So here you have 3 notes which are adjacent, and they claim it's a group. If you have 4 adjacent notes, that could be a group. 3 is a group, 4 is a group. Here, You have three that are alike and one different, but you have a rest. And they argue that in music, rest is also a very strong grouping boundary marker. Same thing here. Notice the grouping of these two is different, even though the notes are the same. The series of notes are the same. Three, what is it? That's a G and a D. So three G's and a D, three D's and a F. And here, and so what you have here is a different grouping because of the introduction of the stress, of the rest. Now, here, the claim is that grouping can also be based upon distance between notes. And here you have a very large distance. This is a D and this is an E. So there's a huge gap, and that's enough to cause a grouping boundary to be introduced. So this is different from this. So you have these three, and then they're alike. And this overrides the rest symbol. And what they say is that these are application of Gestalt principles of proximity and similarity in the assignment of grouping. This is the familiar scale in music. Again, there, as I said, there have been studies which suggest that this is indeed hardwired in the brain. And what you see there is at the top, you see a representation of an octave jump. That's an E, so it's. And then in the middle, you have this one here. There's a tonic, which is the root of the chord, the root of the scale, and then there's its octave, and they divide it in half, and so it's. And then down here, they introduce the notion of the distance between the root and the dominant is a third. So you get. So I got that wrong. This here is this. This relationship is like this. And now here is the triad. And you add them together and you get what's known in classical music, of course, as a chord. All right, and then this is the whole scale. All right, and all of those relationships are they are hardwired, and you use them when you listen to music, finding a tonal center. In this case, it's E sharp, and what you do is you parse the music accordingly. And then here is an example of the beat, the rhythm. Now, earlier I said that groups, they said that groups can be combined into larger groups, and that's what you see here. Yellow Submarine and Yellow Submarine is a group, and you can see same notes rest, same notes rest. This is the grouping, but that is itself a larger group. The whole thing is a group. And you can see here, we all live in a Yellow Submarine rest. That's the first group. And then the second group and the third group. Okay, so the basic unit of metrical structure is a beat, a point in time usually associated with the onset of a note in the musical structure. Beats are combined in the metrical grid and a hierarchical pattern of beats of different relative strength. Now, what that means is this. In the same way that we did a correspondence of syllables to metrical structure, you do a correspondence here of beats to with X's. Each X represents a beat, and that's what this first line represents along here. Now, the second line indicates that of these four beats, the first and the third are the prominent ones. This is the intuition one has when constructing the tree for this particular piece of music. And finally, of the second and the first and the third beat, The first one is the most important. So basically, this is building a musical tree in just the same way that you build a tree over instinctively eagles that fly swim. And here is how it sounds. All right, so that is Jimmy Fallon and Ringo Starr, and you heard that music, you took it in, and basically what Laerdal and Jackendorf are saying is you're being able to take it in is because you have rules based on grouping, metrical structure, and tonality, and that enables you to build a tree over that music in the same way that you're building trees over the words you're hearing from me now. Now there's one more art form, and that's called painting. And I'd like to show you about the shared rules of painting. This was a problem for me for a long time. I didn't really know what the counterpart was. I'm very glad that I was able to finally understand it. In E.H. Gombrich's book, Art and Illusion, which is a wonderful book, and I recommend it to all of you, Gombrich repeats a conversation that took place between Apollonius of Tyana, a first century philosopher, and his disciple Damis. And this conversation was recorded by a 4th century philosopher, and that's how it comes down to us, by the name of Philostratus. And here's the conversation. Then Apollonius asks again, painting is imitation, mimesis? Well, what else, answers Damis? If it did not do that, it would just be a ridiculous playing about with colors. Yes, says his mentor. But what about the things we see in the sky when the clouds are drifting, the centaurs and stag antelopes and wolves and horses? Are they also works of imitation? Is God a painter who uses his leisure hours to amuse himself in that way? No, the two agree. But does this not mean, probes Apollonius, that the art of imitation is twofold? One aspect of it is the use of hands and mind in producing imitations. Another aspect, the producing of likenesses with the mind alone. The mind of the beholder also has its share in the imitation. And that's really the heart of the matter. You can, this is a painting that I had to show you because it seems to me that Andrea Mantegna, the artist, must surely have known of Apollonius's a dialogue with his disciple Damis. It's called Minerva Expelling the Vices from the Garden of Virtue. And there's cloud formation. And I want you to look at this cloud formation closely. There's a face. He put a face in the clouds, I'm sure, and that's an Easter egg, by the way. So what Apollonius is saying is that human beings have built-in pattern recognizers, and that the artist behind representational, i.e. mimetic art, is the ability to put marks and scratches on a canvas in such a way that those pattern recognizers are triggered just as a cloud formation might trigger a built-in face recognition device. Okay, so this is, I think, the heart of the matter. In 2007, a neuroscientist at MIT by the name of Nancy Conwisher gave a talk at the Symposium on Art and Brain at the University of Illinois, in which she suggested that portraits and landscapes, that is to say, works of art that were constructed around faces and bodies and places, were actually works of art that seem to be, well, here's how she says. She says it. The functional organization of the visual brain provides clues about fundamental dimensions of visual experience. Specifically, Perhaps the visual categories that feature most prominently in the organization of the brain play a special role in our visual experience of the world and of visual art. Here's what she meant. This is actually a fMRI color image of an actual brain. That was one of her subjects. And what she did was doing here was showing that there are areas of the brain that are dedicated to certain visual encounters, and those are color coded. And what she showed was that there is an area of the brain, the arrow is pointing to it. These are just different views of the same brain, by the way, left, right, top, and bottom. What you see there is the arrow is pointing to an area of the brain called the fusiform gyrus. And the fusiform gyrus is dedicated to face recognition. If you have an electrode embedded in the fusiform gyrus and you show the subject a picture of, let's say, a tree, it'll stay dormant. But you show it a face and it'll fire like mad. It's basically telling the brain, I'm looking at a face, I'm looking at a face. Turns out the same thing is true of places. This area, which is the green area, is called the parahippocampal area. And finally, there's an area of the brain, again, the arrow is pointing to it, which is called the extrastriate body area. It responds to bodies, to torsos. So what Nancy Conwisher has shown, and many of her colleagues have, and again, the literature here is extremely rich and all converges, that there are areas of the brain which are subsections of the brain which perform, whose neural architecture is dedicated to performing certain functions. And those functions in this case are the recognition of a face, the recognition of a place, the recognition of a body. Now what I'd like to do is to give you a very quick tour through Western mimetic art, beginning with the 12th century. And I want you to observe that it's all about face, place, and body recognition. Cimabue, 13th century, the crucifix. Duccio, 14th century, Jesus and the Samaritan, face, place, body. Face, place, body, Piero della Francesca, the resurrection. This was Aldous Huxley's notion of the greatest painting in the world. By the way, Easter egg, that's Piero della Francesca. Raphael, Virgin in the Meadow, 16th century. Diego Velázquez, Las Meninas, 17th century. William Hogarth, The Orgy from the Rake's Progress, all, you see, everyone, face, place, body, face, place, body, face, place, body, face, place, body, face, place, body. And then finally, Ernest Meissonier, Campaign of France, 1814, an incredible realistic artist, one of the greatest who've ever painted. There he is with Napoleon's Campaign of France, face, place, and body. And then the 20th century abandoned those shared rules. I'll stop now, and in my next lecture, I will tell you what happened once the rules were abandoned.
Thank you. So first we unmute our microphones and do our actual applause, better than virtual applause, for the lecture part of part one of the series.
Please, don't applaud, send money.
And we, so I think it would make sense for there to be questions or discussion for us a few minutes today. If anyone has any questions or comments on the first part, and part two will tell us about the abandonment of these rules and the consequences of that on Thursday at 12:30. So with that plug for the second half, the floor is open for discussion or questions or clarifications or any commentary.
So Vincent, will you MC it for me?
Sure, absolutely. So I'll look
Okay.
for questions in the chat and the Facebook, and also raised hands. And it looks like we have a question from Stiopa.
Thank you. This is just extremely amazing. So my question is about our theories of the pre-modern times arts. How do they deal with cultural variation? Because we know that, and I'm sorry if I'm confusing any details, please correct me, that, for example, Turkish music has the tendency of being microtonal. So it's not tonal in the same way Western music is, and Japanese poetry doesn't rely on stress, but rather relies on moras, etc., etc. So, and the question is, which part, do they have anything in common at all, which we could claim to be hardwired?
Well, I think the answer to that is yes. There has first of all, there have been a lot of work done. Most recently, there's been some work done at MIT by Fedorenko, in which she's shown that there is, like the fusiform gyrus and the parahippocampal area, there's an area in the brain that appears to be dedicated to. And so already the fact that that is a dedicated area suggests that there has to be so what are the constraints? Well, Lerdal and Jackendorf have said, well, they have done for that area what linguistics does for language, but now we have to just get better at it. So, and I think that the question you raise is an excellent one, because what is the relationship of microtonality to tonality? And is microtonality hardwired, for example? I suspect the answer is no. I think it's a learned thing, but I don't know. I mean, I may be wrong on that. So I think that the question you raise is exactly the right question, and it's an empirical question. And in a way, the reason why I wrote this book was because all of the attention to the sister arts that you read about has been focused on culture. And I want to shift the discussion. I want to put another argument on the table. I want to say, hey, let's take a look at what the brain does naturally and see how art arises from that. And the reason why I want to do that is really very simple. When you make the brain do what it does naturally, it enjoys it. And that's why art is there. It's to elicit that pleasure is what I'm thinking. But that's, of course, to go, that's a huge leap. But so I think you should absolutely keep thinking about that, Stiopa. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay, we have another question from Anastasia.
Yes, thank you very much. It was very interesting. So I was wondering, just like there are possible and impossible rules in for linguistics, so in syntax, is the shift in the rules that happened during modernism also a shift towards other possible rules? Is it the case that we cannot shift towards an impossible rule for every area in the brain? I mean, are there such rules that are impossible also for music and for language and for all the areas in the brain?
Okay, well, Anastasia, I'm going to talk about that in the second half of my lecture. But I think what I'm going to say, I'll tell you what I'm going to say, because I don't want to not answer your question. I'm going to say that when artists decided, for whatever reason, that they had to drop shared rules because they had to be new artists, they had to join the new wave, some of them came up with impossible rules, which you had to work in order to understand. For example, Cubism. However, some of them actually hit on other natural proclivities of the brain. So it's very interesting, and I will make an argument for that in my next lecture, that Jackson Pollock did exactly that. And that's one of the reasons why children like Jackson Pollock, not because it looks like finger painting, but that because it's basically recursive. And I will make that. So that's what happened. So here's another way to look at things. When the artists came up with new, art forms, some of them would have been touching on other natural proclivities of the brain, and some of them required actual intellectual activity that had nothing to do with that, and that they were different kinds of things, and that you would expect to find artists doing both. Wallace Stevens and Jackson Pollock hit on other proclivities of the brain. But I think that people like, well, as I say, people like the Cubists, they required that you really think. So you had to construct a new theory in the way in which scientists have to construct theories. Is that okay?
Yes, thank you very much.
Listen, could everybody excuse me for just 1 second? I normally meet with a guy at 2 o'clock, but I'm going to tell him that I'm busy. So let me just write a note to him, so that he won't know won't worry about what happened. All right. Sorry for that. Now go ahead, next.
Okay, so we have another question from Stephen in the chat. It says, what were the shared rules for the novel that we broke in during modernism?
Stephen, I don't know. Is that you, Stephen Bowman? Yeah, okay, look. That's a very interesting question. And here's what I think it boils down to. Is the narrative hardwired? That is to say, is our storytelling propensity hardwired, or is it something that we develop? Now, I think that there was there hasn't been a lot of literature on this, and what I've read about it, I read a book by a man by the name of Boyd, who was arguing for hardwired narrative, but I don't think the vote is all in on that. So I don't know the answer to your question. However, there are certain very suggestive things. For example, I don't think comic strips could be a genre if we didn't have the ability to create narratives. Because what comic strips really are is they're sort of like high points, and what you've got to do is to supply the narrative between them in order to get the joke or whatever. So I think if you were to ask me, is the ability to construct a narrative hardwired? I would say I hope so, but I don't know. I really don't know. And if that's something that interests you, that's a very interesting question to ask. Is our ability to make a story something that is a functional part of the brain in the same way that our ability to see a face? And if that's the case, why? You know, what was its evolutionary value? I don't know. That's why I didn't talk about the novel, because I didn't have anything to say about it. Thank you, Stephen.
Yeah, thank you for your response. It's certainly, yeah, an interesting subject. I look forward to reading your book as well.
Okay, and then think about novels. I mean, think about them. Are there novels? Look, I think Flaubert once said that he wanted to construct a novel based on style alone. But has anyone ever done that? Are there any novels based on style alone? There certainly are musical compositions based on style alone, But are there any novels like that, or do they all have a story?
Okay, we have one more question here by Olga. So thank you for the insightful and inspiring talk. Two brief questions. So is the still life, sorry, one sec. Is the still life also about painting places? And two, what do you think we as readers and authors enjoy as Easter eggs? Why do you think we as readers and authors enjoy Easter eggs? Where can this be hardwired in our brain?
Well, I think it's just fun. I think we enjoy as authors, we enjoy doing that just because it's fun. I wrote a poem, the first line of which was, "I am the diva who sings Dame Vida." And Dame Vida means Dame Life, but Vida is an anagram for diva. I just thought that was fun to do. And I don't think there's anything deeper than that. What is deep is how complicated the Easter egg can be. I mean, my hat is off to Michaud because that's incredible what he did. I can't do anything like that. Anyway, so I think it's just fun. And you don't have to do it. I mean, you can write whatever you want without that. I don't think you can create art without shared rules, whether they're impossible or possible rules. Now, what was your first question? What was your first question, Vincent? You said there were two.
Yes, and the first question.
Is land, are still lifes? Yeah, I think still lifes are to be understood as landscapes. They're places. It's rather interesting. Here's, for those art historians out there, here's something interesting. Take a look at Cubism. Cubism moves from essentially the first stages of Cubism by Picasso and Braque to what's called analytic Cubism. And what you'll see happening, if you look at the paintings, the Cubist paintings, you'll see that they begin to move from paintings in which the body is highly distorted, but it's a body. You can tell you're looking at a body or a face or a place. So that's the difference between analytic Cubism and regular Cubism. Regular Cubism departed from, but not so far from, the natural predilections of the brain that the fusiform gyrus wouldn't fire when you looked at a Cubist painting. But now when you, so a beautiful example, I'll show you that next time, is the accordionist. If there's an accordionist in that painting, I can't find him. All right, next.
So I don't see any more in the chat, and I don't see any raised hands, but I will give a last call to anyone who has questions. If you want to just raise your hand and, or even just unmute and say it out loud, but if not, I think we can probably start wrapping up here.
All right, well, thank you all for listening, and thank you for your questions. They're all excellent questions, and I'm hoping that there'll be future theses.
Thank you, Jay. Go with always with hard copy clapping, audible clapping, and hope to see you all again on Thursday at part 2 of this series, The Mental Life of Modernism, part 2, Thursday at 12:30 New York time. And our other lecture for tomorrow afternoon, an entirely different topic, is on the Institute website. And thank you again, Professor Kaiser, Jay, for this talk, and we'll hear the second part on Thursday. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody. Thank you so much for coming.